The resignation letter had desk drawer been sitting in mark drawer for almost 11 months. He had written it late one Sunday evening after another week of 12-hour workdays. The words were simple. Thank you for the opportunity. I've decided it's time for a new chapter. He never sent it. It wasn't because he doubted his abilities. It wasn't because another opportunity never appeared. In fact, several had. A former colleague invited him to join a growing consulting firm. A friend offered to help launch a small business. Even his wife encouraged him to consider a career that would make him happier. Yet every time he came close to saying yes, the same questions quietly appeared. What happens to our health insurance? Can we still pay for college? What if the business takes longer to succeed? What if the economy slows down? What if we lose the house? Mark wasn't trapped by his employer. He was trapped by everything connected to leaving. For generations, changing jobs was often seen as a step toward something better, a higher salary, greater freedom, or a fresh beginning. Today, for many middle-class Americans, changing jobs can feel less like an opportunity and more like stepping away from a carefully balanced financial system. The most powerful force keeping people in place isn't always loyalty. Sometimes it's the growing cost of uncertainty. And to understand why millions of capable, experienced professionals remain in jobs they no longer enjoy, we first need to understand how work itself became tied to nearly every pillar of financial security. For much of the 20th century, changing jobs was often associated with progress. Workers left one company for another in pursuit of higher wages, better opportunities, or a different lifestyle. Career mobility was considered one of the defining strengths of the American labor market. The willingness to move, adapt, and pursue new opportunities became part of the country's economic identity. Today, the labor market still appears remarkably dynamic. Millions of Americans change jobs every year. New industries continue to emerge. Remote work has expanded opportunities for some professionals, and unemployment has remained relatively low during many recent periods. From the outside, the system still looks flexible. But beneath those encouraging statistics, another trend has quietly developed. For many middle-class households, changing jobs has become significantly more complicated. Not because opportunities have disappeared, but because the financial consequences of leaving have grown. The modern American worker depends on employment for far more than a paycheck. A single job often provides health insurance for an entire family. It contributes to retirement savings through employer matching. It may include life insurance, disability coverage, stock compensation, paid parental leave, tuition assistance, or flexible spending accounts. Leaving a job today frequently means reevaluating an entire financial ecosystem rather than simply replacing one source of income. Healthcare illustrates this shift particularly well. Unlike many developed economies, health insurance in the United States remains closely tied to employment for millions of working-age adults. Changing employers can mean navigating different provider networks, deductibles, prescription coverage, and monthly premiums. Starting an independent business often requires purchasing private insurance, which may cost substantially more while offering less predictable coverage. For families with children or ongoing medical needs, this uncertainty becomes a major consideration long before salary comparisons begin. Retirement has undergone a similar transformation. Previous generations often relied on defined benefit pension plans that promised predictable income after decades of service. Today, retirement security depends much more heavily on individual savings, employer-sponsored 401(a) plans, and long-term investment performance. Changing jobs can interrupt contribution schedules, delay employer matching, or require difficult decisions about transferring retirement assets. The risks are manageable, but they are no longer invisible. Housing has added another layer to this equation. Millions of homeowners secured historically low mortgage rates during recent years. Those mortgages have become valuable financial assets in their own right. Accepting a new job in another city may require giving up a mortgage with a 3% interest rate and replacing it with one carrying substantially higher monthly payments. The promotion itself may increase income, yet the higher housing costs could offset much of that financial gain. In some cases, remaining in the current job becomes the more rational financial decision, not because the work is fulfilling, but because the surrounding financial structure discourages change. The same pattern appears in everyday household budgets. Childcare payments, college savings, insurance premiums, transportation costs, and mortgage obligations all depend on stable cash flow. When fixed expenses consume a larger share of income, periods of uncertainty become increasingly expensive. Even a temporary reduction in earnings during a career transition may create consequences that last for years. As a result, many professionals begin evaluating opportunities through a different lens. The question is no longer, could this make my life better? Instead, it becomes, could this disrupt everything we've spent years building? That subtle shift changes the meaning of career mobility. Changing jobs was once primarily an economic decision. Today, it has become a family decision, a healthcare decision, a housing decision, and a retirement decision, all at the same time. This helps explain why many experienced professionals remain in positions that no longer inspire them. The issue is rarely a lack of ambition. More often, it is the growing realization that leaving one job now means temporarily stepping outside an entire system of financial stability. To understand how these invisible pressures influence real families, we need to look beyond the statistics and follow one professional who appears successful by every conventional measure, yet quietly feels that his career choices have become smaller with each passing year. At 48 years old, Mark had achieved nearly everything he had imagined when he graduated from college. He was a senior project manager at a large engineering firm outside Dallas. His career had been steady, his performance reviews consistently strong, and his income had gradually climbed to nearly $185,000 a year. By every conventional measure, he was successful. His wife, Jennifer, worked part-time as a school administrator. Together, They owned a comfortable 4-bedroom home, purchased several years before mortgage rates surged. They had 2 teenage children, both beginning to think seriously about college. Their retirement accounts had grown steadily. Their emergency fund was healthy. Friends often asked Mark for financial advice. Yet every Monday morning, he found himself sitting in the company parking lot for a few extra minutes before walking into the office. Not because the work was difficult, because he no longer felt connected to it. The projects had become repetitive. The meetings seemed endless. The excitement that once came with solving complex engineering problems had slowly faded into routine. For nearly 3 years, Mark had imagined doing something different. He wanted to build a small consulting business, specializing in industrial efficiency. Former clients had already told him they would hire him. A former coworker had even offered to become his first business partner. On paper, the opportunity looked promising, but every time Mark opened another spreadsheet to compare the numbers, the same conclusion appeared. The business itself might succeed. The transition was what frightened him. Leaving his employer meant replacing family health insurance. Jennifer's part-time position offered limited benefits, so most of the household's medical coverage depended entirely on Mark's employer. Private insurance would cost significantly more, with different deductibles, provider networks, and uncertainty they had never experienced before. Then there was retirement. Every year, Mark's employer matched a generous portion of his 401 contributions. Walking away from the company didn't simply mean losing a paycheck. It meant giving up years of predictable retirement growth. The house created another layer of hesitation. They had refinanced during a period of historically low interest rates. Their monthly mortgage payment was remarkably affordable compared with current market conditions. If the consulting business struggled, and they eventually needed to relocate or downsize, they knew replacing that mortgage would be dramatically more expensive. Ironically, one of their greatest financial successes had become another reason not to change anything. College was never far from their minds. Their oldest daughter hoped to study architecture. Their son dreamed of attending an out-of-state university. Mark and Jennifer had spent years building college savings, but tuition costs continued rising faster than they had anticipated. Starting a business now meant introducing uncertainty at precisely the moment their children needed stability. One evening, Mark received another call from the colleague who wanted him to join the consulting firm. The offer was generous. The market was growing. Several contracts were already waiting. "You've been talking about this for years," his friend said. "So what's holding you back?" Mark looked around the kitchen before answering. His daughter was studying for exams. Jennifer was reviewing household bills. A folder labeled "College Planning" sat open on the table. Nothing in that room suggested financial hardship. Everything in that room represented financial responsibility. He finally replied with a sentence that surprised even himself. "It's not the business I'm afraid of. It's everything I'd have to risk before the business has a chance to work." That distinction stayed with him long after the conversation ended. Mark wasn't lacking confidence. He wasn't avoiding hard work. He simply understood that his salary supported far more than his lifestyle. It supported healthcare, retirement, housing, education, predictability. The job had gradually become the foundation beneath every other part of his family's financial life. Leaving it no longer felt like making a career decision. It felt like temporarily removing the cornerstone from an entire structure. Mark's story is increasingly common among experienced professionals across America. The question is no longer why talented people dream about doing something different. The more revealing question is why so many of them decide they simply cannot afford to try. To answer that, we have to look beyond individual choices and examine the larger system that quietly rewards stability while making change increasingly expensive. Mark's situation is easy to dismiss as a personal choice. After all, no one is forcing him to stay. His employer has not threatened him. The consulting opportunity remains available. Technically, he is free to leave whenever he wants. But economics often shapes behavior without removing freedom altogether. The most powerful constraints are frequently the ones that make every alternative feel increasingly expensive. That is exactly what has happened to much of the American middle class. Over the past several decades, multiple systems have become more interconnected than they once were. Employment is no longer simply where people earn an income. It has become the gateway to healthcare, retirement security, predictable cash flow, and long-term financial planning. Housing reinforces this relationship. Millions of homeowners purchased or refinanced homes during years of historically low interest rates. Those mortgages became more than loans. They became financial advantages that are almost impossible to replace under today's borrowing conditions. Accepting a new opportunity in another city may require purchasing a similar home at a significantly higher monthly payment. The career move may improve income, yet the housing market can erase much of that financial gain before the first paycheck even arrives. Healthcare creates another layer of dependence. For many families, employer-sponsored insurance remains the most affordable way to access medical care. Changing jobs often means comparing deductibles, provider networks, prescription coverage, and monthly premiums rather than simply comparing salaries. Starting an independent business introduces even greater uncertainty. The entrepreneur is no longer evaluating market demand alone. They are also calculating the cost of protecting their family's health. Retirement planning follows the same pattern. The transition from traditional pensions to individually managed retirement accounts has shifted more responsibility onto workers themselves. Every interruption in employment can affect contribution schedules, employer matching, and long-term investment growth. A career decision that once centered on professional ambition now carries consequences extending decades into the future. Education adds still another layer. Parents approaching their children's college years often become increasingly cautious. Tuition continues to rise. Student debt remains a concern. Many households prioritize predictable income over entrepreneurial risk simply because the timing feels too important to gamble. Even inflation changes the equation. When groceries, utilities, insurance, transportation, and everyday necessities consume a larger share of monthly income, households naturally become less willing to tolerate temporary uncertainty. The margin for experimentation becomes smaller. Economic flexibility quietly gives way to financial preservation. This helps explain an apparent contradiction within today's labor market. Companies frequently report difficulty attracting experienced workers. Employees often report feeling dissatisfied or emotionally disconnected from their jobs. Yet, turnover among many mid-career professionals remains lower than expected. The issue is not necessarily a shortage of ambition. It is a growing mismatch between professional aspirations and financial reality. Economists sometimes describe this phenomenon as reduced mobility. But the phrase barely captures the human experience behind the numbers. People are not simply staying in place geographically. They are remaining in careers they have mentally outgrown. Not because opportunity has disappeared, because the systems surrounding work have become increasingly difficult to separate from the rest of life. This is where the concept of asterisk golden handcuffs becomes especially relevant. The rewards attached to stable employment become so valuable that walking away feels increasingly irrational, even when the work itself no longer provides satisfaction. These handcuffs are rarely visible. They are built from mortgage rates, health insurance, retirement matching, stock compensation, college savings, predictable paychecks. None of these are negative on their own. In fact, each one represents a sensible financial benefit. But together, they create something larger than the sum of their parts. They create a system in which stability becomes progressively more valuable and change progressively more expensive. For previous generations, a career often served as a vehicle for building a better life. Today, for many middle-class Americans, the career itself has become the structure that holds every other part of life together. And once work carries that much weight, leaving a job is no longer just a professional decision. It becomes a decision about identity, security, family, and the future itself. That realization changes not only how people work, but how they think, dream, and imagine the possibilities still available to them. Very few people wake up one morning and suddenly feel trapped. The feeling develops gradually. It begins with postponing one decision, then another. A business idea can wait until next year. A career change feels safer after the children finish college. Retirement can be delayed for a few more years. The dream isn't abandoned, it is simply postponed. Over time, those postponements become a way of life. Psychologists often distinguish between external freedom and perceived freedom. A person may technically have the ability to make a different choice, but if every alternative carries consequences that feel increasingly difficult to absorb, that freedom begins to feel theoretical rather than real. This is the emotional reality behind what many professionals quietly experience. They are not prisoners of their employers. They are caretakers of a carefully balanced financial system. Every decision is filtered through responsibility. Responsibility to children, responsibility to aging parents, responsibility to a mortgage, responsibility to retirement, responsibility to maintaining the life they spent decades building. None of these obligations are unreasonable. Together, however, they leave remarkably little room for uncertainty. As a result, work begins to occupy a different place in a person's identity. Early in a career, a job often feels like a path toward possibility. It is a tool for building the future. By midlife, that same job may become the mechanism protecting everything that has already been built. The emotional difference is profound. When work represents possibility, people naturally think about growth. When work represents protection, people naturally think about avoiding loss. Behavior changes accordingly. Professionals become less willing to negotiate aggressively, less willing to relocate, less willing to start businesses, less willing to accept temporary setbacks that could eventually lead to greater fulfillment. The goal quietly shifts. Instead of asking, what could make life better? People begin asking, what could put everything at risk? This psychological transition explains why burnout has become so complex. Many professionals are not exhausted solely because they work long hours. They are exhausted because leaving no longer feels like a realistic option. Every frustrating meeting, every weekend email, every organizational restructuring, every unexpected deadline is weighed against an invisible calculation. Is it worth risking health care? Is it worth risking retirement? Is it worth risking the mortgage we may never be able to replace? Eventually, resilience begins to resemble endurance. People continue performing well. They continue meeting expectations. From the outside, they appear stable and successful. Inside, however, many describe a growing sense of emotional distance from work, not because they no longer care, but because they no longer feel that work belongs to them. Instead, they feel that they belong to the system surrounding work. Perhaps this is the quiet transformation reshaping the modern middle class. Economic security has become so interconnected with employment that many people no longer measure success by the freedom to choose. They measure it by their ability to avoid disruption. And when preserving stability becomes the highest priority, even a successful career can begin to feel less like a source of purpose and more like something that cannot be left behind. For generations, work represented movement. A first job opened the door to experience. A better job created new opportunities. Changing careers often meant building a different future. The workplace was seen as a bridge between where people were and where they hoped to be. That idea has not disappeared. Millions of Americans still build fulfilling careers, launch successful businesses, and reinvent themselves every year. Opportunity still exists, but for many middle-class families, the price of pursuing that opportunity has quietly increased. A career is no longer just a source of income. It has become the foundation supporting healthcare, retirement, housing, education, and countless financial commitments that extend far beyond the office. The job itself may no longer provide the same sense of purpose, yet leaving it can feel like removing the cornerstone from an entire financial structure. Perhaps that is why so many professionals describe an emotion they struggle to explain. They are not simply tired. They are careful, careful about every decision, careful about every risk, careful about disturbing a system that has taken decades to build. This may be one of the defining economic stories of modern America. Not that people have lost ambition, not that opportunity has disappeared, but that stability has become so valuable and uncertainty so expensive that freedom itself begins to feel different. But because the greatest constraint is rarely the absence of choice, it is the growing cost of making one. And when millions of capable people begin staying not because they love where they are, but because leaving has become increasingly difficult, the future of work is no longer just about employment. It is about whether economic security still leaves enough room for people to choose the lives they truly want to live.